Emotion is very powerful, but I think we underestimate how subjective it is. So when we get swooped into the emotion like in Majora's Mask, sometimes we can be led to mistakenly believe that other people should feel that same powerful impact you felt for everyone else who views it, right? This isn't just Majora's Mask and its emotional value, to be fair. Just think about your favorite Zelda game and your feelings for it, and when you hear a disagreement with it, it hurts, doesn't it? But again, it goes to show how subjective our feelings, emotional or otherwise, are towards our Zelda games from one person to another. In the past, I've shown that Majora's Mask's emotional elements don't work on me at all, and it's very true to this day. Why? It's because I developed tunnel vision from action games. For example, when I played The Last of Us, I know horror gamers, understandably, will have their heart rate rising when passing through the scary areas of the game, and that's essential to the enjoyment of the game, getting dread from it. However, as an action gamer, I'm focused way less on my feelings towards the situation and completely calm, and instead I'm focusing on tunnel vision on how to handle and solve the problem at hand. That's why I'm not into those horror series like zombie games, Resident Evils 1, 2, 3, Silent Hill, or into the world games like Final Fantasy VI, Bioshock, or Majora's Mask. Because I'm not capable of feeling dread, and as the fans of those games will attest to, you need to have some degree of environmental immersion to enjoy these games. So why is this important? Well... For anyone wondering, the Stone Tower Temple is still my least favorite 3D Zelda dungeon of all time ever since that 35 Zelda Dungeons collab video. I know, boo, boo, yep, bring it all in, yep. Oh, Slashstar, you should agree with the popular crowd and like a Stone Tower Temple because it's the popular thing to do. What will happen to my poor ego if you disagree with me? Welcome to Zelda. One thing I've always encouraged on my channel is to be you. Don't go with the popular crowd. If you like something, like it. If you hate it, tear it to pieces. This is a poster I have hung up in my room. If you blend in with the popular crowd, you disappear because you're just like everyone else. How can you be unique and stand out if you agree with everyone else word for word and kiss the popular crowd's butt? Be brave and stand up for your unpopular opinions. Alright, so let's put that rant aside and let's break this down one step at a time because there's a lot to digest here. There's a lot of additional pieces to it that leads to me not favoring this dungeon at all. Reason number 1. The lead up to the dungeon is absolutely dreadful. I'm not talking about the dread and referring to immersion from the environment. I'm talking about dread and not looking forward to something. That'll save an observant comment or two. Leading up to a dungeon is an important aspect to a dungeon's enjoyment. If you remember, the lead up to Lakebed Temple from Twilight Princess had a very tedious Twilight bug hunting session. Plus, remember that super tedious overworld puzzle that led to Dungeon 3 in Oracle of Ages? Arguably the hardest overworld puzzle in the series? I can guarantee you that Game Boys have been thrown and broken about that. So Iconic Canyon is not an interesting place, and to be fair to the environment, it's supposed to be like that, but it's still a deal breaker regardless. Of course there's my desensitization, but the place is absolutely empty except for a deck you scrub, a part in Cafe's quest, a house where the cursed father is, a conducting Poe, and well, a few pampered mummies, a battle arena, and that's essentially it. If you look at the other places in Majora's Mask leading up to their dungeons, they're filled with so much more meaningful content, but that's not the worst of it. First off, the well is horrific with its extreme backtracking for its items. Iconic Castle, while the music is awesome, it's not fun and thought out compared to places like Forsaken Fortress. Especially with, guess what? More backtracking for the Goron Keg to blow the roof, which is not fun for the first time player and realizing all of these dumb errand quests. And then there's the ascent to the dungeon itself. Really? Oh yeah, the Elegy of Emptiness. How many times do you use that between here and the dungeon? It isn't a few, definitely into the double digits. To be fair, a large reason I dislike it is because I don't like the Elegy of Emptiness as tune by itself, but when you play it over and over and over, it starts to get grating. It's not a stellar introduction to the dungeon. Reason number 2, the dungeon's music makes me really uncomfortable. This dungeon's music was designed from all 4 of Link's instruments he uses throughout the game, which does make it highly immersive and creative for some. Let's get that right. But there are 2 parts of it that make me really uncomfortable. First, the haunting melody that comes in. I know this is really petty, but that part of the song makes me feel really hollow, if that's the proper word for it. When I try to put my finger on my feelings for that hollow feeling, it feels like my depression I had for 6 months in 2013. It feels like really minute ripples of those feelings I had from that time. It doesn't affect me. Don't get me wrong, and I won't go down that path again for sure, but it's still an uncomfortable feeling reminding me of those times for some weird reason. I can't properly explain it. Let's drop that and focus on the other nuisance. The ocarina, all of its notes just sound wrong. I think it's because it's a terrible mashup with the other instruments and it sounds cringeworthy every time it plays. But this one is because it's simply personal taste, thankfully, and I don't like it. It doesn't fit well with the rest of the song. I won't go too far into this bullet point because everyone is incapable of convincing ears to things you like to hear or don't. What sounds great or terrible to your ears is not by choice. That would be a lost cause, so let's move on. Reason number 3. The dungeon is simply too linear and isn't fun compared to the other 3 dungeons. I'll get to the ceiling flipping mechanic in a moment in the next bullet point. For now, I remember going through this dungeon for the first time when I was finishing Majora's Mask, and I remember it feeling so unfulfilling. Like, let's put aside the environment and music and everything else aside for a moment. When I was traversing through this place, I was going through hallway after hallway of throwaway puzzles. More Elegy of Emptiness crap, having to build up light for a tedious reflection puzzle, having to flip the room continuously just to push a simple block across the room. Those aren't fun! They're not fun! It's not as fun as strategically knocking out a center column pillar, which is non-linear in turn, by the way. It's not as fun as swimming as Azora in the Great Bay Temple, which is also non-linear, by the way. It's one straight corridor, through and through, even when getting the ceiling flipping involved. Lastly, what about the Deku, Goron, and Zora sections? Those are supposed to be fun and provide variety, right? Even putting the tedious Elegy of Emptiness part aside, not really. You only use the Goron and Zora parts one time, very briefly each, and therefore only passing one simple and short obstacle. The long bend with the Deku Scrub was fun, I very much admit, but I wish they did more of those thought out obstacles like that. That's the only puzzle I enjoyed from those 3 sections, or the entire dungeon. There's so much missed potential with the linearity and puzzle solving here. Reason number 4. The ceiling flipping mechanic does not do anything to compensate for the negative points of this dungeon. Let's address Stone Tower Temple's biggest positive point, the flipping of the dungeon. Now again, just like the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time, while I like the concept of the idea with its physics, in my opinion, I was more focused on how I was going to redeem the negatives of the dungeon. Does the new upside down layout correct those errors I talked about? Are the puzzles themselves better than the right side up version? No. Is the upside down dungeon more non-linear than the right side upside? No. Does it make the music better? No. It doesn't bring any new positives to the table to start dispelling those negatives. Think of it like that you're playing a bad video game or a bad movie and you get hit with so many negatives left and right that you're desperately looking for anything positive or redeeming to justify playing or watching it further. That was the point I was getting to when I flipped the dungeon. Understandably, I know Zelda players think that is such an outstanding positive that the ranking will soar unconditionally just by its premise alone, but not for me. The negatives are pressed so much into my face about this dungeon that I desperately need something to remove them. But because the temple flipping doesn't do anything to fix those negative problems, it doesn't have any value to me. If the right side up and the upside down versions both treat me miserably, why should I give my unconditional respect to the upside down brother that mistreats me just as much as his right side up brother does? Let's run down the list in closing. The environment doesn't affect me. I don't like the music. I don't like the puzzles. I don't like the linear progression. I don't think the dungeon flipping adds anything. Just nothing works. Like I said in Lord Jabu Jabu's Belly in my Ocarina of Time ranking, I can't pretend to understand what other Zelda players like about this dungeon because me personally, I don't enjoy it myself. So I can't pretend to know what you like about it, and I think it would make me extremely arrogant to try to relate to something you do feel that I don't. Alright, I think it's time to move on, and I did the best I could. You're welcome to leave your comments, but it's time to move on. Come on, let's go to number 3. On the surface, Woodfall Temple doesn't seem like much to elaborate on, but I don't think so. I think there's something really interesting to analyze here. I actually call this the Wallflower Dungeon. Not just because of the flowers you can dive into as a Deku scrub for a bit of joking fun, but I'm also implying the actual definition of a wallflower here. If you don't know in social terms, a wallflower is a term to mean a person who feels introverted or excluded at a party or group gathering. I'll be the first to admit it. I'm a wallflower. I'm not a social guy. In Zelda circles, if Woodfall Temple is the only dungeon getting highlighted to talk about on the spot, it seems to get praise. But if other dungeons join the party and get compared to it, Woodfall Temple gets forgotten about and excluded to become a wallflower, ignored due to the popularity of other dungeons. I could probably hand this off to being first dungeon syndrome in Zelda and call it a day, but I think Majora's Mask's first dungeon case is a little different. Let's go back to Ocarina of Time's first dungeon for a moment, the Great Deku Tree. Back then, you were slowly getting used to some mechanics of Zelda, like encouraging exploration to find the Kokiri sword, and rummaging around in chests in the grass saving up for a Deku shield for 40 rupees. Then, before you knew it, you were thrust into the first dungeon right off the bat, grabbing a slingshot and jumping through webs. But the point I'm making is that new mechanics are constantly being introduced to make the experience very memorable. I think because of that, the Great Deku Tree has an overall greater impact in Zelda fans' eyes over Woodfall Temple because of the constant introduction of new concepts to keep the adventure interesting. Woodfall Temple, I think, doesn't have that advantage. Within 5 minutes of the game starting, you become a Deku scrub. Nothing wrong with that. And you learn techniques like blowing bubbles or hopping on water. At that point, you go to Clocktown, then to the Southern Swamp, and then in about 2 or 3 hours for a first time player, you make it to Woodfall Temple. Problem now is that you've been around these techniques for 3 hours at this point. You know how to dig into flowers. You know how to hop on water. It's old news. So when you arrive at Woodfall Temple, I think the attachment fades because of the redundant mechanics. So instead of it having the impact that a proper dungeon should, it essentially becomes an extension of the poisonous swamp you've been traversing for the past half an hour before entering this dungeon. Instead of like with Ocarina of Time with shuffling things around every few minutes, mechanics change every few hours in Majora's Mask when you get a new mask. That essentially sums up what I think of Woodfall Temple. It's padding and more fluff that you've been doing as a Deku scrub for the past 3 hours. Is it still good? I think so, but I think the greatest weakness to this dungeon, in my opinion, is that they should have introduced this dungeon way earlier, just like Ocarina of Time did. I think I would have been a lot more satisfied if I went to the Woodfall Temple first, and then to Clocktown second, but that's a whole nother rabbit hole to get into. Woodfall Temple is okay. It's unmemorable because of the same repetitive, wishy-washy mechanics, but compared to the 3 other dungeons, it doesn't quite have that deep impact that leaves too many lingering thoughts with Zelda fans, and I guess I'm one of them. I got a lot of feelings here. In fact, I think this dungeon, more than any other dungeon, has influenced how I see Zelda as a whole and started to warm up to liking Majora's Mask. That is a mouthful. Where do I start? First off, I didn't like Majora's Mask growing up like I do now. I didn't like the side quests. I didn't like the time limit. Of course, I never got into the end of the world theme. I didn't like that you needed more strategy guide help with this game more than any other 3D Zelda game. I didn't like that the dungeon items only revolved around the arrows. There's a lot of things. This is relevant to judging the Snowhead Temple and the Great Bay Temple because I hated these places growing up. I despised them almost as much as I did the Stone Tower Temple. If you're forced to do a dungeon literally 5 times over for each dungeon because you ran out with a 3-day timer, it infuriates you. It changes you. It leaves deep-rooted grudges that are not easy to get rid of. Just like numerous places around Majora's Mask, having the combination of the time limit and no strategy guide stresses you out. You don't think properly. Then guess what? The game goes, ha ha! Lose your progress like Zelda 2 Adventure of Link, you bitch. So, when did I start liking the Snowhead Temple and Great Bay Temple?
Let it go, my son. I'm not here to fight.
Let it go. Just let it go. When I started to shift the blame off the game's mechanics and then towards myself for being incompetent at the time. Majora's Mask is a hard game when you first play it. Snowhead Temple is a hard dungeon. Great Bay Temple is a hard dungeon. So what do? I was doubly hurt by the lack of strategy guides and time limit, but how would blaming those help? It won't magically increase my skill level. It won't throw me a bone and solve these dungeons for me. I should own up to it. I sucked at the game at the time. In the end, it's a matter of focusing on getting better and adapting to the challenge, which is what all video games encourage you to do. I was just young and stupid at the time. Anyways, going back to Snowhead Temple. It is a hard dungeon, but I think that's the charm of the experience. There are 5 floors with a center pillar, so it becomes a navigational maze of keeping track of where you are, where you need to go, and with knocking out the pillars in the middle column. The problem gets compounded with the backtracking once you get the fire arrows and at where the chests are. Where are the small keys? Where's the boss key? The map and the compass can help you, but of course you've got the center pillar and you've got to judge the distance between the floors, which isn't easy. And then there's the center pillar itself where you can knock out sections from the 2nd and 3rd floor. Stay too conservative or get too greedy with knocking those things out, then you'll block yourself out of necessary routes to go. And then you got a lovely little time limit there glaring in your face like it did to me in my younger years. So yep, there's that. Thankfully, there's a way to reset the center column, but again, that's time consuming, then you'd have to climb the whole dungeon again. It's definitely a game of planning ahead, which is what makes this dungeon very unique. It's very non-linear, you just can't plow right through it. I think the Snowhead Temple is one of the most ambitious and thought out 3D Zelda dungeons to date, even when comparing it to modern Zelda standards like with Breath of the Wild. It's amazing that this only took a year to develop and make this game, especially with this dungeon and the Great Bay Temple in tow. I hope that Zelda does come out with a similar dungeon to this with Breath of the Wild too, but well, that game is more open world wilderness and less dungeon oriented, so I doubt it, but I hope it happens someday. Alright, time to tackle the big one. I've always tried to find a definitive answer to this question. Is the Great Bay Temple a fantastic dungeon? Or is it a terrible dungeon? Zelda fans seem to be completely split down the middle on this controversial dungeon. I know that seems like a whole big can of worms to dig through, but I think if we put a bit of context here that those questions are easier to answer here than we think. Now get this. PC gamers versus console gamers. Everyone is split on this. A lot of gamers favor PC gaming, and a lot of gamers prefer consoles, sometimes both. There isn't one definitive answer. There's a whole range of opinions between those two mindsets. Now, PlayStation versus Nintendo versus Xbox. Again, there are swarms of gamers that have opinions on all 3 sides to some degree. But the point here is, with all of these, there's no one definitive answer because everyone everyone is different and prefers different things. It's in our nature as human beings that we want and prefer different things. Otherwise, we'd be 7 billion clones on this planet. So to answer the definitive question about Great Bay Temple being fantastic or terrible, the answer is, it depends on what you view as a positive or negative. For example, with the switching of the currents of the dungeon, do you see a well thought out observation puzzle here? Or do you feel your insides melting with fury that you can't find your way? I was in that negative boat. Remember my rant from the Snowhead Temple? I know how extremely infuriating that is. So what I want to do now is that I want to make this dungeon much easier for you to navigate, whether you like it or hate it. What's also interesting is that I've never heard another Zelda player point this strategy out. So let me point it out. Let me make things much easier for you. This is my tic-tac-toe board. There are 3 settings for the currents. No pipe activated, the red pipe, and then the green pipe. Then there's the 3 chutes to go in from top to bottom. The top chute, the middle chute, and the lower chute. So, want to know the secret to dominating this dungeon? You ready for it? Go into each chute from top to bottom, from left to right. No? That's it. That's all you have to do. When there is no pipe activated at the start of the dungeon, comb through the top, middle, and the bottom chutes in that order. And then activate the red pipe at the bottom chute. With the red pipe activated, repeat the process and then complete the red pipe and change the current. And then with the green pipe activated and located above the turbine at the top of the dungeon, comb through the chutes and then you'll reach the boss at the bottom chute of the green pipe. You'll get every essential item on the way if you comb through every room. I'm dead serious. It's that simple. So from that, there's my first big positive about this dungeon is that there is a contextualized strategy to navigating this place. Just like Snowhead with figuring out the timing of knocking out the pillar, it doesn't have to be a blind strategy. It's a hard puzzle where with some observation you can get around it and make it much more manageable. Just don't go Call of Duty and run into every random chute you find. Just like Snowhead Temple, observe the place, stake it out. That's how I found the above strategy. So does this concept deserve your praise or does it deserve your condemnation? That's up to you and your experiences, but I think that tedious puzzles that encourages us to push our limits to puzzle solving is overall a brilliant idea. Another positive, the ice arrows are much more practical than the other arrow types from the other dungeons. Having to actively judge how far you can jump onto ice platforms you make does add another dimension of calculating and an element of tension because they don't last a long time. It was used very effectively to put you on the spot and test your spatial awareness. I don't know about you guys, but the mini boss was really fun, and I personally wish that the dungeon would have swapped this with the real final boss because it was really creative and thought out. Having to worry about the threatening bubbles while using a couple of different strategies available to you to take it out. Definitely my favorite mini boss in the game. Anything else? Personally, I really liked the Zora suit. I really did. I sucked at it personally when I was younger, which was why I gave the dungeon and the masks despicable marks back then, but when I started to learn not to hit the walls for once and hit the currents the right way, it goes a long way to develop fondness. It is my favorite mask, by the way, the Zora mask. But again, I totally get if you hate the controls and mask overall in this dungeon. After all this positives, I do have one big negative. I think the only thing I don't really enjoy about the Great Bay Temple nowadays is the boss, which I hate because I'm so inconsistent against it. Some days I happen to do really good against the boss, and other days I do so bad that I'm breathing fire and how angry I get. It's not the worst thing in the world, and it didn't make it to my top 10 worst Zelda bosses. The positives definitely overruled the negatives and my feelings towards the boss. Alright, closing time. Alright, as I promised for my voting poll, next up will be the Skyward Sword dungeon rankings, and I might slip in a project or two if I can find the stinking time for once. Anyways, ciao, and I'll see you for the next list.